Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today, just to get my own back on Dr. Philip Chase. Hello, Philip.
Hello, AP.
Philip has been doing Malazan poetry analysis, and I thought it only fair that I completely steal it from him, and we're going to do the poetry analysis on my channel because meh. And
That's eloquent. Very
yeah, that's
eloquent.
the sophisticated put down that you needed, young man. Now, the poem that we're going to look at today, Philip, this is from Reaper's Gale.
Yeah.
And there are no spoilers at all about really the Malazan story or Reaper's Gale in this. It's to look at this poem, and the poem is Stone Bowl, which is attributed to Fisher or Fisher Keltath.
Yeah.
And so I'll read out the poem, and what I thought we'd do is you could lead us through the analysis of it, because one of the things that I wanted to be clear about with people, a lot of my focus, a lot of my specialism is on narrative analysis. Poetry analysis is not a strength of mine. And I wanted to make it obvious to people. I know that this is not a strength of mine, and I'm not embarrassed by it. I find analyzing poetry a lot more difficult than I find analyzing narrative. And I thought this is an excellent opportunity to show, like, learning from someone who is better at it than me. And as much as I hate admitting that you're better than me, Philip, in anything.
I could probably beat you in tennis too.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. So, but this is the important thing. This is the great thing about talking about literature, about talking about books. It's a learning experience to draw from the strength of others. So that's what we're going to do today. Are you okay with doing that then, Philip?
Let's go for it, AP. Although I have a feeling you're going to be casting a few fireballs during this discussion that are going to be illuminating not only for me but for your viewers. So I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Well, I'll put this up on screen, and then we'll get started. I took the stone bowl in both hands and poured out my time onto the ground, drowning hapless insects, feeding the weeds, until the sun stood looking down and stole the stain. Seeing in the vessel's cup 1,000 cracks, 1,000 cracks. I looked back the way I came and saw a trail green with memories lost. Whoever made this bowl was a fool, but the greater he who carried it.
That's beautifully read.
So this is in Reaper's Gale. Obviously, we see it's called Stone Bowl. The poet attributed is Fisher Keltath, and we've seen a number of these epigraphs, a number of these poems attributed to Fisher. So, Philip, like, talk us through the basic imagery here. Well, or I can give you a very basic one, which is obviously this is a guy, someone holding a stone bowl. And you can imagine the visual being the bowl is filled with water and it's spilling out everywhere, and then the person realizes the stone is actually riven with cracks. It has been leaking the entire time, despite the deliberate things that this person has been spilling out the bowl for. And that's how it sort of ends, that they realize that the bowl is badly made or fractured in some way.
Yeah.
So
that's a literal sort of summation of what this poem is conveying on a literal level. Yeah. So I think what I would like to say first is that I have an interpretation, and it is exactly that, an interpretation. I don't know exactly what Fisher Keltath had in mind when he wrote this poem, or Steven Erikson, who is posing as Fisher here. I don't know, but I know what it evokes in me. And that's what I like to talk about when I talk about poetry. I don't know, it's not, we've said this before when we talked about Malazan poems, and it bears repeating. A poem is not a puzzle to be solved for the right answer. I think a poem is something that evokes feelings, associations, and you bring your own unique experiences to that. So I have an interpretation of this I'm going to talk about, but I am so open to hearing what other people think, and you as well. So, but for me, it is a metaphor. Obviously, yeah, you can read it on a very literal level, and you gave us a very nice summary of that. But to me, it's a metaphor. And if we take it line by line, I think it becomes sort of obvious what the metaphor is about. But I think it's about a life. It's about a life. It reminds me a little bit of the lines from Shakespeare's Macbeth, out, brief candle. And the lines that follow talk about life being like an actor on a stage. But it kind of not making sense, that there's a lot of tragedy in life, and there are a lot of things that just don't seem to make any sense. There's an absurdity to it. And I think there is an element of that to this perception of life that is conveyed in this poem. So I took the stone bowl in both hands and poured out my time onto the ground. Let's just take that much. So if we take the stone bowl as, you could take it as a life, as a body, as a person's body, which is obviously, you read later that there are a lot of cracks in this stone bowl. So there's a lot of imperfections in a human body, both on a physical level and on a mental level. We are full of cracks. We are full of fissures and contradictions, and we're full of pathos and tragedy and triumph as well. So, but I love the idea of pouring out my time onto the ground. This is, in a sense, to me anyway, it's conveying the idea of how one spends one's life, right? Pouring your time out. And of course, it gives the idea that there's something in the bowl, some kind of liquid that is being poured out. So this is your life force, your journey, whatever. Now, it's interesting because the next few lines give a sense of both destruction and I think creativity from this life that's been lived. So drowning hapless insects, that sounds destructive, doesn't it? That doesn't sound like a nice thing, at least from the insect's point of view. So that's definitely kind of a negative feeling to it, and feeding the weeds. So there's a sense of growth there, but weeds aren't usually something that we consider positive. So there's definitely a negative connotation there, I would say, to some degree, although there is growth involved here. There's something living from that, an organism. Until the sun stood looking down and stole the stain. So our life passes by, and we perish, we die. And the idea of the sun drying up that liquid that has been spilled out from this bowl, the life that we've lived, eventually we will pass, and every footprint we've left in this world will disappear. That is the nature of life. And we are, and as Erikson often does, reminds us not just of our mortality, but how we fit into this grand scheme of things, and that there is a vast world around us that we are just a tiny, tiny part of. So that's how I take the first stanza. Did you want to say anything about the first stanza?
Well, why don't I add to what you had gotten from the first stanza, because I think I have a slightly different take that is complementary and sort of adds to similar things, just in a slightly different way. So we're very familiar with the expression, like, the idea of a body being a clay vessel, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. This idea of a fragile vessel that holds our life essence. And we're familiar again with the idea of literalizing a metaphor. You said yourself, how you spend your life, how we spend time. Time is the thing that we spend. We have a finite amount of time, and that is held in our earthly vessel. Now, obviously, this is not a clay vessel in that we would typically have in that metaphor, but a stone bowl. And this idea of when we think of the vessel encompassing time, we always think of it being controlled, but a stone bowl is much more open. And while we may deliberately pour out our time, we may deliberately spend our time, there will be times when it slops off to the side, when we waste time. Yeah. When we waste our lives. And that's the transition there. When we waste time is one thing. When we waste our lives, when we do things that are unintended. And so you have this deliberate and poured out my time onto the ground, but drowning the hapless insects. And for me, so much of our lives, we see ourselves as the center. We see ourselves as the most important, the hero of our own story. Yeah. And everyone else is a periphery, is peripheral to our lives. that we are the most important thing, and how we spend our time is the most important thing. And so everyone else are around us are the hapless insects.
Yeah.
But the idea of feeding the weeds. So pouring my time out on the ground, drowning hapless insects, feeding the weeds. Our mistakes, the destructive aspect of our life, whether we intend it or not, is wasting, and it's not bearing fruit. It's not adding to the sum of things. We can have a terribly destructive impact in the world when we are not careful. And then with that, and the sun stood looking down and stole the stain. I love that visual image, because we've all seen that. I don't know if you've ever seen kids where you're trying to entertain them on a very, very hot day, and you give them a little bucket of water and a paintbrush and say, go and paint the fence. And they put the water on the fence, and it gets a much darker color. And then slowly it just dries out, and as if it was never there. And this is that idea of tempus fugit. Time is fleeting.
Yeah.
And everything is going to survive us. We are so transitory in this world that the world itself, no matter what stain we leave, what destruction we leave behind, if we have not spent our time wisely, eventually is all going to be erased. Yeah. And there's this, in some respects, that's actually quite a welcome thought. Any mistakes we make over time eventually will not be bad over a great enough period of time. But at the same time, it means all of our actions on this world over a great enough period of time, they're going to disappear as well. So I like that complexity of both a positive and a negative meaning there. And I think that fits alongside what you were saying, rather than it being a different interpretation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they complement each other very well. Yeah. So, yeah, lovely. So let's, I guess, move on to the second stanza then. Seeing in the vessel's cup. Now, in my book here, 1,000 cracks is not repeated, but I kind of like the way it's repeated as it's written out here. I don't know if that's a typo or
it could be. I mean, I'm looking at an e-text, and I hadn't realized that I hadn't checked it in the physical text. Well, yeah. that would make sense, because it is an odd repetition, because it appears nowhere else.
It's a bit odd, but it adds a slight poignancy to it, I think, in a way. Just the idea of almost lamenting these imperfections in the stone bowl in the vessel. But in the original, it's just 1,000 cracks. So, but seeing in the vessel's cup 1,000 cracks. So obviously, I mentioned before, this is the idea of the imperfection of the individual, and the idea of us also. I mean, cracks imply a certain breaking up, right? A breaking up of an individual, and it's a bit alarming to think of oneself that way, I suppose. But at the same time, there might be something consoling in that our dissolution might be an acceptance in a way of us becoming part of the greater thing all around us as well. So I actually don't see it as unilaterally bad to have all these cracks and imperfections. It's just part of life. I think I sense that in this poem, this kind of more acceptance than anything else of the way things are. And so I looked back the way I came and saw a trail green with memories lost. Let's just take that much. And this is the person obviously looking back on their life, right? And here's where I see a mixture. So again, it's this, you could say, oh, well, these are memories lost. What are we but a collection of our memories? Your identity, my identity, is a product in some way of speaking of our memories. And memories are such imperfect things. They are constantly tweaked in our minds. We are always messing around with our memories. They are notoriously unreliable, and they fade with time. So what does that tell you about your identity? You know, it's in a way a kind of scary thought, but also, as I said before, I think a beautiful thought as well. So the idea here that I looked back and I saw a trail green. Now, green is positive associations. Green is life, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, there's this loss, but looking back, you can see that this life that has been spilled out has had, it has caused some destruction, but it also has caused creation, looking back on it. So it's really a mixed thing here. And the idea of, again, it's just almost just the letting go of one's memories, letting go of one's self, of one's identity here. So I love that. I find it very beautiful. And whoever made this bowl was a fool, but the greater he who carried it. And this is the part that really reminded me of the lines from Macbeth. But there is an element of absurdity to this. But I don't think it's a cynical thing here at all. I don't take my feeling anyway is this is not a cynical tone here. It's more of having a laugh at oneself in a way, of seeing this vast thing we call life in a way that is kind of playful, that it is in a way a game, that life plays a game on itself of sort of hiding from itself. And the discovery that one is connected to all things is part of the game, and it's a beautiful thing. So I just love this. Whoever made this bowl was a fool. And I think that, anyway, the way I'm hearing the word fool here is not in a bitter way. It's in a more playful way. And of course, turning it on, the speaker is turning it on himself or herself or themselves. But the greater he who carried it. So the person who carried the bowl, that's the speaker, presumably, feels like a bit of a fool too. But again, not in a bitter way. At least that's how I'm reading it. So.
Yeah, and so again, for my part, complementing this, and it's interesting, that thing about the repetition of the line, because obviously just looking at this e-text, I mean, one of the things I find interesting about that was because it was a nine line stanza followed by a 10-line stanza, with that being the additional line, and I actually thought that was quite interesting because it emphasized that line. But if you take that away, I still would end up with emphasis on that line. Because seeing in the vessel's cup, so looking down into this vessel, now that so much of this time has spilled away, the liquid has spilled away, you're getting close to the bottom, you're getting close to the end, and it's been riven with 1,000 cracks. And if we think the idea of a stone bowl, it seems so solid, it seems so impervious to damage, much like in early life. I don't know about you, but when I was a much younger person, I was convinced I was immortal, that nothing bad was ever going to happen to me. And I had that false sense of security about my own indestructibility. And that's what I get a sense of here, that these 1,000 cracks, as we age, look at the wrinkles, the laughter lines, the wrinkles, the folds that appear. And this is a natural part of our makeup. But as you said, that's quite a literal interpretation of it.
Yeah.
And this idea that our very fabric is flawed. We are flawed creations. We have our imperfections. We have our flaws. We have our little ticks, our peccadillos, our idiosyncrasies. We are not perfect beings. But that is the thing that makes this stone bowl unique.
Yeah.
That's what makes us unique. Our flaws, our experiences are who we are, and no one else has one quite like it. I looked back the way I came, and again, I agree with you. This is looking back over your life, seeing how these cracks, these imperfections have led to your life touching all of these other lives. And that trail is green, is lush, is verdant, because we can live good lives.
Yeah.
We can have this positive impact on the world. And where we had thought, when we were marching through in our youth, in our security, in our potentially our arrogance, that we were the most important thing, looking back on it now, we see it not as weeds, not as hapless insects. We see it now as this beautiful trail, this beautiful life that we led, and we get a different perspective on it. And then this whole thing of with memories lost.
Yeah.
And exactly what you said, in that our memories are imperfect. And when we look back, we forget some of the places we've been, some of the people we met and interacted with. Our memories are not like a computer hard drive.
Nope.
It's very difficult to remember everything unless you've been blessed with one of those special eidetic memories. But now this trail, we can see from the trail where it branched off, where it touched all these other lives. And even if we don't specifically remember those moments, we get a better sense of where we have been and how we got to this position. And then I loved that this last bit of whoever made this bowl was a fool. Think, who made us? And you go, well, that would be, you know, parents. Philip Larkin has a very famous poem.
Oh, yes.
Which I don't know if I have a filter on my channel for naughty words, but the opening line of that poem is one that is often quoted by school children. But anyway, whoever made this bowl was a fool. And we can see that very much as a criticism of who would make such an imperfect vessel? Who would make something that is riven with all of these flaws, that has all of these cracks in it? Because that person's an idiot. That's not what you have a bowl for. A bowl is meant to hold things, not let them dribble out and spill out over time. But at the same time, but greater he who carried it. And there's a wonderful moment of ambiguity just in this. Does that mean greater the fool he who carried it? Or does it mean greater as in the person who made it may have been a fool, but the person who lived the life actually lived a great life?
Yeah.
And it's a nice moment of ambiguity. I think the major thrust of it is whoever made this was a fool, but we are just as great fools, if not greater fools, for living our lives. And it's that part and parcel of being part of an imperfect humanity, a continuation of the follies and the idiosyncrasies of our line, of our friends, all of these imperfections that make us who we are. And we celebrate that. We celebrate our uniqueness.
Yeah.
But there is that slight suggestion. They might have been a fool, but I lived my life. I spent it. I lived the full thing.
Yeah. Isn't it beautiful how this poem, I think it strikes us both as melancholy and simultaneously celebratory, if that makes any sense at all. I just find that to be pretty amazing that in one poem you get that I mean, you could read it. I think somebody could approach it and read it as too melancholy, but I don't read it that way. I feel that there's this lightheartedness to it as well, this bit of absurdity there that is kind of an appreciation as well, looking back.
I think potentially, Philip, that is because both you and I are at a certain stage in our lives now where, you know, we've gotten to say we're much more comfortable in our own skins. We're much more comfortable with understanding our weaknesses, of understanding things that we are not good at. And you go, it's not something to get defensive about or angry about. It's an acceptance. I am who I am. I will always try to be better, but I know who I am. And we also, I don't know about you, but we've encountered a lot now of mortality. And certainly, you know, when you're much younger, it might be the odd much older relative who passes. But I think now we've gotten to the stage in our lives where contemporaries have been lost. And we have an appreciation then. And I am not saying that people younger than us don't have this, but I think this is part and parcel of what gives us that particular perspective of the sense of time passing and an appreciation of the time that we have remaining and what is important.
Yeah, I agree that first of all, there are young people who've experienced tremendous loss as well, of course, as you said. But the longer you're around, the more times you've been around the sun on this rock, the more losses you're going to experience. And that is part of accepting that, I think, is part of life, and learning to deal with that and to And that may be why these bowls are so cracked as well, because we do experience grief and suffering and loss, but I think there's a sense of beauty and celebration as well. We can't forget the greenness that has it sprouted in the wake of this bowl that with its contents sloshing around. Right.
And that's the thing, is that we having understanding a sense of mortality is not necessarily to be morbid about it,
Right.
but it's to celebrate the good, to enjoy the good, to have those memories of, oh, do you remember when, and you relive that moment and you bring it all flooding back, and that can be such a joyous thing. That there's an example that yes, time will fly. Time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. Yeah, you must be aware of that one.
You give me some new ones every time we talk. So,
tempus fugit, like time is fleeting, and the sort of the other way of thinking about it is carpe diem, like seize the day. There are all of these different aphorisms and expressions to think about the transitory nature of our time on this planet, the fact that we are just vessels of clay, that we are these transitory things traversing the mortal plane. But that is not always something to be feared. It is not always something to be mourned. Sometimes it's something to be celebrated
and embraced.
And life is extraordinarily complex. Like all of the different things that we talk about, people who latch on to the simple answers. Simple answers can be very, very reassuring. Mm-hmm. Simple answers can give you a sense of stability. But when you start thinking about things, life is extraordinarily complicated. People are extraordinarily complicated. And I don't know about you, but I have never met anyone who did not have flaws. And I have been lucky enough to find people in my life who my flaws are not ones that irritate them too much. That it's like my flaws kind of line up with their flaws and they're kind of okay with it then. It's we have the same sorts of flaws, it's all fine. But it's not about finding the perfect person or the perfect people. It's about finding those people who are perfect for you. That we all have this, and it is part and parcel of what makes us us, what makes us unique.
Yeah. And personally, I have accepted my absurdity to the degree that I even wore a tiara once on the channel. So yeah.
And that's the thing. If you can't, I remember discussions that other people have had brilliant discussions about this, but in the midst of terrible tragedy, or in the midst of like the most desperate situations or terribly sad situations, suddenly finding that sense of humor and the absurd, and you just start giggling, and it's part of our response to all of this, at least some of us. And that finding the humor in the darkness is like finding a light, and being able to hold on to that and celebrate it brings more light into that darkness. And that's not to say that everyone has to do this, and it's also not to say that when people are finding humor in these very dark situations, they're not dismissing it. They're not ignoring the darkness. It's a way almost of fighting back against the darkness to find that light, to find that solace and comfort. And so embracing absurdity, the older I get, the more I embrace absolute absurdity and enjoy it.
Yep. And that is a grand theme throughout the Malazan books, I would say, right? The embracing of absurdity. Most certainly. And it's part of the soldier's humor, I think, as well. So it's a beautiful thing. And this Erikson guy, he's not a half bad poet either, is he?
I occasionally can string a couple of words together, you know. Hey, he's not too bad.
Sometimes even well enough for someone to sing the lines, eh? Any brash buster, you know?
And on that note then, Dr. Fantabulosity, why don't we call an end to our discussion here? Thank you so much for joining me for this.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure.
And for those of you watching, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.